Hello and welcome, students, to another episode of History at Home. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the most important king in Babylonian history, that is King Hammurabi, and his most famous accomplishment in world history, which is the creation of his code of laws. Before we begin looking at Hammurabi, however, let's reflect back on the last few days in class and talk about Sargon. Sargon of Akkad is the world's first emperor. He also creates the world's first empire, which we today call the Akkadian Empire. Our class definition of an empire is a large territory that brings together several different groups of people with many different cultures and or languages under the rule of a single leader or government. So if we look at the empire of Sargon, we can see this is a vast territory, much larger than just one individual city-state. It extends from the Persian Gulf in the south, nearly up to the Black Sea in the north. So this is a very large area of land controlled by one leader of government, and it's also going to unite people of different cultures. So throughout Mesopotamia, you would have different languages, different patron gods or goddesses, depending on the city-states. But Sargon unites this area under his rule and forms the world's first empire. He begins forming this empire first by invading the Sumerians into the south. So he comes from up north near Akkad. He's going to invade different city-states in the south of Mesopotamia, which is the area that we today call Sumer. And he's going to conquer these city-states and eventually add them to his empire. He also comes from humble roots. We've compared and contrasted his legend tablet, the Sargon legend tablet, which kind of chronicalizes where this man came from. His childhood closely parallels the story of Moses. We've seen some very big similarities, but also some stark differences between these two stories. The two figures here, Sargon and Moses, share some really big time similarities. Both individuals were abandoned in a river and they were later found and adopted. They were both placed in baskets and floated down rivers, but we also noted that there were some differences between these two stories, namely the areas of the world that they're taking place in. Sargon's has taken place in Mesopotamia, whereas Moses and his story take place in Egypt, and also the social class that adopts the baby. Sargon is adopted by the lower ends of society, whereas Moses is adopted by the pharaoh's daughter, so he is at the upper echelon of Egyptian society. So that raises a big time question. How did Sargon come from humble roots to eventually becoming history's most important king into that period of time? So how did Sargon become a king? Sargon's adopted father, Akkad the irrigator, worked for the king Ur-Zubaba, the king of the city-state Kish. And from there, as Sargon aged, he eventually rose to the position of the cupbearer for the king Ur-Zubaba. A cupbearer is essentially a butler in a sense. He's the person that would serve drinks at the royal dinner table. But even though that sounds like a very kind of demeaning job, it's actually really important. The cupbearer would be tasked with making sure the king was not poisoned by someone else. So this is a man that really had an important job within the royal court. He was there to protect Ur-Zubaba from potential poisonings. As a result of being so closely attached to the king and constantly interacting and discussing him, he really is actually a pretty important person within that royal court before he eventually becomes the king. So there's actually a story involving Ur-Zubaba and Sargon and how Sargon eventually rose up to power and overthrew Ur-Zubaba. I'm going to break it down as simply as I can for you. So Ur-Zubaba started to grow suspicious of Sargon and eventually wanted him dead. History is lacking the details as to why Ur-Zubaba became so suspicious of Sargon, but nonetheless, the relationship between these two people turned sour. So Ur-Zubaba, the king, hatched a plan. He sent Sargon to a nearby king called Luga-Zagesi, hoping to get him killed. However, his plan backfired. Luga-Zagesi befriended Sargon, and they became good friends, and together they hatched the plan to invade Kish and overthrow Ur-Zubaba. They overthrew Ur-Zubaba. Ur-Zubaba fled and kind of fades away from history. And then the relationship between Sargon and Luga-Zagesi also turned sour. So now you have Sargon in control of a city-state known as Kish, whereas Luga-Zagesi is in charge of Umma, and they go to war. Their armies fight one another. The winner of this battle is Sargon. So now he not only controls the city-state of Kish, but also Umma, and he starts to invade Sumer afterwards and starts to conquer other city-states and unite them under his rule. And this is how he forms eventually the world's first empire, known as the Akkadian Empire. So he does rise from humble roots and eventually kind of pecks his way to the top, becomes the king of Kish, eventually defeats the king of Umma, unites those city-states under his rule, and then starts to conquer other city-states in Sumer and eventually northern Mesopotamia to form what we today again call the Akkadian Empire. The ways in which he kind of assembles this empire, his mechanisms for assembling the empire, he really has two major advantages over anyone else at the time period. He has a professional standing army, and he also utilizes the latest technology, namely the composite bow. So his professional army numbered around 5,400 soldiers. They're well trained and organized. They fight in that famous phalanx formation in which you stand in evenly dispersed rows with overlapping shields. You put the spear in between the gaps of the shields, and it's a very defensive formation and very tough to break. He's able to run down other armies in the area using this battle formation. He's also going to have his archers use a more advanced bow known as the composite bow. This increases the range and force that you could fire an arrow. So his archers could hit the enemies before the enemies could return fire. The force that the arrows delivered were increased and more deadly than the archers from the other armies. And he's really able to kind of mow down other armies within Mesopotamia in a 10-year period to form that giant empire. We have afterwards Sargon ruling for about 50 years of time. He'll then die of old age, and the Akkadian Empire kind of quickly starts to crumble after the death of Sargon. The Akkadian Empire will only last about 200 years, and it collapses around 2154 BCE. Then we have a period in which there's no major empire in Mesopotamia. In fact, the city-state of kind of rises to power. But around 480 years after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the city-state of Babylon begins to rise to power, and they will do the same process as Sargon and form the second major empire in Mesopotamian history, which is known as the Babylonian Empire. So the Babylonian Empire now takes over as the second major empire in Mesopotamian history, and this is a much longer lasting empire from 1895 BCE until around 619 BCE. And it's going to cover an area just slightly smaller than the Akkadian Empire. It's not quite as large, but it does start around the Persian Gulf in the south, and it goes nearly up in covering the entirety of Mesopotamia. Not quite all of Mesopotamia, but nearly all of Mesopotamia. And the most famous king from this nearly 1,000 year-long reign is King Hammurabi. So let's look at this king, King Hammurabi, the most famous king from the Babylonian Empire. He reigned or ruled, interchangeable words, from around 1810 BCE to 1750 BCE. This is around 3,800 years ago. And he will inherit the throne from his father, a great example of a dynasty in which you have one family in control for many generations. In fact, when Hammurabi eventually passes away, he's going to pass the kingship on to his son. And his major accomplishments during his lifetime, he's got two big ones. He's going to largely expand the Babylonian Empire through many different military campaigns. When Hammurabi inherited the throne, the Babylonian Empire was really not that large at all, and it really only included three major city-states: the capital Babylon, Kish, and Sippar. When Hammurabi takes over, he is going to conquer vast territories throughout Mesopotamia and triple the size of the Babylonian Empire. He's going to conquer Sumer, and he's going to set his sights north in Mesopotamia, up towards what we today call Syria. So this dark region here is kind of the starting point and where Hammurabi inherits the empire. It's a small empire, and by the time of his death, the empire has nearly tripled in size, and that's the lighter area that you see out here. So this was all conquered by Hammurabi. In addition to that, even more important than this empire building process and the expansion of the empire is that Hammurabi is credited by history as creating the world's first written laws. And today we call that set of laws Hammurabi's Code. And that's what I want to focus on with you today with this video, is I want to look a little bit further in detail with Hammurabi's code. So over here to the left is a actual artifact of Hammurabi's code. It sits in a museum in France called the Louvre. And what you see really are three sections. You have a base here. You have all this cuneiform writing, which makes up the midsection of the stele, with all the laws written here in cuneiform. And then you have this piece of artwork up here, making up the final third of the stele. So let's take a look at some basics about Hammurabi's code. It's engraved on a 7.5-foot tall stele, and a stele is just a big piece of stone. It's a stone pillar. And there are 282 laws etched into the midsection of this stele. And these laws deal with just about anything that you can think about in the ancient world. It includes laws on homicide and assault, laws on divorce and debt, laws on adoption and trade, and also laws on what would happen to a tavern keeper if they watered down the beer that they served to their patrons. So it's numerous, it's really in depth, and it included laws on just about every facet of Mesopotamian life. Interestingly enough, this stele was actually not discovered in Iraq, but actually in Iran in 1901 CE, so about 115 years ago. The reason why we find it out here in modern day Iran is because the Elamites, a new kingdom forming to the east of Babylon, conquers Babylon, and they will pillage and steal from all of the major city-states in this new conquered territory, and they're going to bring back Hammurabi's stele from Babylon to their kingdom as a trophy, to show the people and to show the people their power and their influence and their domination over their neighbors to the west. So the Hammurabi's code was discovered in Iran because it was stolen by this group called the Elamites as a trophy when they conquered parts of Mesopotamia. With that being said, let's take a look first at this top third of Hammurabi's code, this piece of artwork up here. So what we see are two figures here. We have a man standing upright, and we have a man seated wearing a crown. To the left is Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, and seated in this throne here is Shamash, and he is a sun god in Mesopotamian history, and he's also the god of justice. So if we're looking at this piece of artwork, we see that there looks like a couple things going on. We see an exchange of goods going on here with Shamash, and we also see this kind of contemplative stance by Sargon. It almost looks like they're engulfed in some type of discussion or conversation. This is an example of ancient propaganda. If you were an ancient citizen and you looked at this piece of art, even if you could not read, you could interpret it and you would get a couple items from this piece of art. One item that you would notice is that both Hammurabi and Shamash are the same height, which means that they are equals in stature. Shamash is not depicted as being larger or taller than Hammurabi. They're seen as equals physically, and this kind of shows Hammurabi's power. He is being portrayed as an equal to a god, and not any god, but rather the god of justice. And this image really depicts Shamash, this god of justice, giving away the 282 laws below to Hammurabi. So these laws are not necessarily just human-made, these are divine laws. And that would have a big impact in the person or in the people of Babylon. You would have to obey these laws because they weren't just the laws of Hammurabi, they were the laws of the gods. So, a couple things about Hammurabi's code. We actually get some really big time ideas involving law and order from Hammurabi. One of the most important is what we today call the Presumption of Innocence. Hammurabi's code includes the earliest example of the Presumption of Innocence. In fact, Hammurabi and his law code has such a great influence on world history and even modern history that if you go to our Supreme Court here in the United States and you look above where the justices are seated, you will see famous lawmakers in history depicted above them. And circled here is the first lawmaker, Hammurabi himself here. And next to him would be Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. And this is an important idea really in American law and global law. The presumption of innocence is the idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty. And that is really profound when you think about what the opposite would be. You are seen as innocent until someone can prove you guilty. If the opposite were true, you could be accused of the crime and you would have to then prove your innocence. Um, with this being said, the innocent until proven guilty idea means that you are innocent by law, and the prosecuting people or prosecuting parties have to prove your guilt by providing evidence or persuasion. That's a really, really important idea, that you are seen as innocent until someone can prove you guilty and not the other way around. So again, this is one of the earliest examples of that idea, the presumption of innocence. It's very important. You are innocent until proven guilty. And we can see that idea ingrained within the very first law for Hammurabi's Code. Law 1 out of the 282 laws states, if anyone accuses another man of murder, but cannot prove it, then the accuser shall be put to death. So right off the bat, we understand that if you are going to accuse someone of a crime, but you cannot prove it, you don't have the evidence to prove someone's guilt, there will be a consequence. You cannot just go around accusing people of committing a crime. You need to provide proof of that crime. And if you make an accusation without providing proof, it could end your life. Another big time idea in Hammurabi's Code is the burden of proof. You need to prove the guilt of someone you accuse of a crime. You need evidence. Law 3 gives us insight into this idea. Law 3 states, if anyone brings an accusation that involves a capital murder charge and does not prove what he has charged, the accuser shall be put to death. So this kind of elaborates on that first law that we just looked at. You need to prove that someone committed a crime, and if you can't prove it, you suffer a severe consequence. In this case, you would be killed if you accuse someone of a crime but could not prove it with evidence. We also see within Hammurabi's Code that they had a basic trial system. And this trial system, based on this law, involves the idea of sorcery, which is what we would call today witchcraft. If you accuse someone of sorcery, there was a trial system to prove if that person was a witch or not. And what the people are going to do, this trial system really allows the gods and goddesses to judge the innocence or guilt of the accused party. So in Law 2, we see this trial system unfold, and it's a long-winded law. If anyone accuses someone else of sorcery, the accused shall leap into the river, also kind of letting the gods decide. If he or she drowns, the accuser shall take possession of the accused's house and belongings. However, if the accused reaches the shore unharmed and the river thus proves that the accused is innocent of the charges, then the accuser shall be put to death, while the one who leaped into the river shall take possession of the house and belongings of the accuser. That is a lot. So let's break down Law 2. If you are accused by someone of witchcraft, you will jump into the river. Essentially, we are letting the gods and goddesses decide your fate. And there's two scenarios. Either you survive this or you drown during this. If you survive, the judges judge that you were innocent. And as a reward, you get two things. First, you get the accuser's house. And secondly, you get some retribution. The accuser is put to death and executed by the state. So if you survive, you get the possessions of the accuser's house and the house itself, and you get to see the accuser get put to death. If you do not survive this trial system and you drown, the gods deemed you as guilty. And as a punishment, you receive, most importantly, you die. And secondly, the accuser gets your possessions and your house. Finally, one other big time idea that we see in Hammurabi's Code is that a lot of the punishments fit the original crime. Many of the punishments for breaking the law are similar to the original crime committed. So let's look at law number 196, the most important law in Hammurabi's Code. This law you have heard of before. If a man destroys the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. More simply stated, an eye for an eye. If you get into some type of fight and you severely injure the man, so much so that his eye is taken out, he is blinded from your punch or your blow, your punishment is that you will suffer the same fate. Your eye will be taken out or blinded as a punishment for breaking this law. Okay, folks, tomorrow we're going to look at Hammurabi's code in more detail in class, and I will see you then.